It's at this point that I have discovered the mystery person who turns up in the middle of my federal police investigation into the directors of Johns Hopkins, which involves Frank Bosnell, the director of Amcare Labs that's defrauded my company and destroyed all my encryption opportunities in Australia and also in Geneva, was the director of Business Risk International, who had employed CIA agent Joseph Queller, who arranged the fatal meeting for Danny Casolaro. Also, A.B. Krongard, who's the executive director of CIA. I'll do a podcast, as I said, further on him, on how he fits into PROMIS in a very big way. But at this point, during my interviews with Ray Levasse, I was able to confirm the identity of the mystery stakeman who'd come to Australia. So I decided at this point, Michael has been telling me all about the role of Frank CARLUCCI, Robert Booth Nichols, Harry Gillam, MI6 agent, Eric Ciacals, CIA and MI6 assassin, who was in Mexico, had brought down Gough Whitlam and Dr. Jim Cairns. So I decided to investigate the claims that this mystery stakeman made when threatening me. And so I then went and had a look at the records of the Baron of Beef restaurant and guest house up in the Dandenongs. And yes, it's true. It was owned by one of the senior directors of the Hawthorn Football Club. His name was David Wainless. He confirms that in the early 1970s, before joining Hawthorn Football Club as assistant secretary, he later became the federal director for football manager over a period of many years, 76 and 78, during 2 night premierships of the Hawthorn Football Club. But he says categorically, in partnership, and this part's important, his partner is Robert Booth Nichols. In partnership, he owned and operated the Baron of Beef restaurant and guest house, a facility synonymous with the Hawthorn Football Club. So the claim that Robert Booth Nichols has made is true. I go further and do an investigation about the corporate identity of the directors, but Robert Booth Nichols claimed and boasted that he used the Baron of Beef restaurant as a safe house for CIA and Mafia during the Nugan Bank years. And this is now confirming the things that Michael had shared with Danny Casolaro and also with myself. Michael had written letters to me in June 2004, 4 months before Robert Booth Nichols comes out through me, telling me that the evidence that Danny was investigating relating to the dismissal of Gough Whitlam. So I found the newspaper articles that the directors of the Baron of Beef restaurant, which Robert Booth Nichols and the assistant secretary, the secretary of the Hawthorn Football Club owned together in 1975 and right through the 70s, was owned by Jack and Renee Farr. It turns out the newspapers confirm they were the best friends of Dr. Jim Cairns, the Australian Federal Treasurer. You can't make something up like this. This is independent of everything that Michael has said. It actually is the official records coming from the mouth of Robert Booth Nichols when coming to Australia to threaten me. And yes, it was the base for the Hawthorn Football Club. And yes, in 1969, Dr. Jim Cairns, a longtime friend of Renee and Jack, who owned the Baron of Beef restaurant, which Robert Booth Nichols is a major investor, was assaulted in his home by the Painters and Dockers Union. It turns out, Michael was telling me about the Royal Commission into the corruption of the Painters and Dockers Union their links with the Nugan Bank and their links with Mafia and Gambino Mafia, and also with the CIA for importing and trafficking drugs into Australia and the shipment of arms on a large scale. And I will do another podcast on the Royal Costin Inquiry, because I met with the Assistant Queen Chancellor, Douglas Mayer, in his chambers only 3 months earlier before Robert Booth Nichols appears, and he confirmed that yes, the identity of Robert Booth Nichols was known to him during their investigations, and that he was linked to anti-Australian government political activities, which now confirms independently the role that Robert Booth Nichols and Frank CARLUCCI played. It turns out, here's the newspaper article, Dr. Cairns and the painters and dockers had assaulted him in his home, and he took refuge at the Baron and Beith restaurant to recover from the assaults and injuries that he endured. So the CIA and Mafia, with Nugan Bank, Michael Hand, with Ted Shackley, together with William Colby and Robert Booth Nichols, were all over Dr. Jim Cairns through their friends, his personal friends, the directors of the Baron of Beith restaurant. So Michael had written to me in June before Robert Booth Nichols turned up and said that Robert Booth Nichols, that Frank CARLUCCI was responsible for setting up the CIA MI6 sting to bring down the Gough Whitlam government and destroy the federal treasurer, Dr. Jim Cairns. Here's a photograph of him being assaulted and escorted out of his house before taking refuge with his family to stay at the Baron of Beith restaurant guest house. This is overwhelming evidence of the activities of this man, Robert Booth Nichols, in Australia, and substantiates the claims and the evidence that Michael Riconosciuto was giving to Danny Casolaro in 1991. Danny Casolaro was going to blow open that this octopus, including Ted Shackley, William Colby, Robert Booth Nichols, and Frank CARLUCCI, had brought down the Australian government in 1975. And hence the loans affair. And this is the evidence that I've uncovered, that's substantiated by the letters that Michael wrote to me, and I went through the records of Danny Casolaro, and he had the names of the people involved in his own handwriting, and he proposed to write a whole chapter on the dismissal of Australian Prime Minister Gough Whitlam. He had advised definitively Casolaro, and also had re-advised me in June 2004 that it was Frank CARLUCCI and Robert Booth Nichols with CIA and MI6 agents who orchestrated the $4 billion Arab loans affair to destroy the Whitlam government in 1975. And these are the people who were involved in the sting. I've got all the documents and correspondence of William Colby in his communications with Henry Kissinger, the correspondence and memos of Ted Shackley contacting the head of ASIO in Australia, expressing serious concerns about Dr. Jim Cairns and the Prime Minister Gough Whitlam, that they're a threat to the alliance with our Echelon network, Five Eyes. It turns out that Gough Whitlam was exposing the identity and name of a CIA operative who was working at Pine Gap, the Echelon facilities, involved in anti-government activities of CIA, intercepting his memos, correspondence, and carrying out aggressive activities, political activities, to destroy the Gough Whitlam government. This is the reason they had to get rid of Gough Whitlam, is that he was concerned about the bombing, and so was Dr. Jim Cairns, that the terrible bombing of civilians in Vietnam. Also, the possibility that he was going to prevent nuclear ships, nuclear submarines using the Australian Navy ports, and also possibility that he would shut down Pine Gap, the Echelon network, given that CIA is spying on the Australian government. I have the correspondence of William Colby confirming that he had just met with the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia to be supportive of activities for the USA, who set up the $4 billion Arab loan, with Frank CARLUCCI, Robert Booth Nichols down here, and Harry Gillam, MI6 agent, Eric Searcals, the MI6 CIA assassin, to bring down Dr. Jim Cairns and the Australian Prime Minister. They were doing it with Michael Hand. The evidence is overwhelming. The correspondence is going backwards and forwards between Ted Shackley, William Colby, and Frank CARLUCCI was a personal friend of Robert Booth Nichols, using him for anti-American activities in Australia. In 2004, Robert Booth Nichols was then being exposed in a $250 billion US security fraud in London involving Samuel Israel. And in 2007, his defense, when the US government and FBI are seizing all of his assets, confirming his properties in Australia, Italy, and London, the UK, at the address of 5 Half Moon Street, Mayfair. He confesses that he had been working for Frank CARLUCCI and CIA on anti-American activities in Australia. It's in the court testimonies, which I will do as a full podcast when they are seizing the assets. He then fakes his in 2009. Apparently his body was cremated. No one witnessed it. Fell over, hit his head. We believe that he's still alive, living in South America, but the fact is he admitted that he worked for Frank CARLUCCI to suppress anti-American activities, and that was the loans affair. He was doing it together with Michael Hand, and the own testimony when he coming out to threaten me is that he confirms that the Baron of Beef restaurant was used as a CIA and mafia safe house during the Nugan Hand Bank era. Here is the newspaper articles. Michael had advised Danny Casolaro and also myself in letters that it involved Harry Gillam, an MI6 agent who set the loan up, an Arab loan for $4 billion, together with Eric Searcals. These are the key people involved. They were linking across to the brother of Dr. Jim Cairns, and this scandal caused Dr. Jim Cairns to be sacked, removed from government, given the evidence that these two were selling to Rupert Murdoch's paper and Australian newspapers to bring down the whole scandal. It was a definitive CIA MI6 sting orchestrated by Frank CARLUCCI, Ted Shackley, Henry Kissinger, William Colby, using Robert Booth Nichols and Michael Hand to orchestrate the whole scandal. And here is Prince Fahd Saud, who I have the correspondence, confirms in his correspondence he'd met months earlier to get his support for America. And he is financing this $4 billion loan. Harry Gillam confirms in an interview at 5 Half Moon Street, Mayfair, when he's selling all the documents and evidence to bring down the Gough Whitlam's government and destroy Federal Treasurer Jim Cairns, that he was doing it with Group Captain Michael Stevens, who was liaison officer during the Second World War with the US Air Force. He's UK Group Commander representing Rolls-Royce in Paris, and they set the meeting up for Dr. Jim Cairns in Paris for the Arab loan with this man, who is meeting and forming an alliance with America with William Colby. So Ted Shackley, Frank CARLUCCI, Henry Kissinger and William Colby were the architects of the whole scandal that brought down the Australian government, dismissal of Dr. Jim Cairns, Federal Treasurer, and dismissal of the Australian Prime Minister Gough Whitlam, who was threatening Pine Gap, Echelon satellite network spying operations on Australian soils that was spying against our government at the time. And so let's go on and show, I have the handwriting and notes of Danny Casolaro confirming he was investigating who was Harry Gillam and Eric C. Cowles, and what role did they play with Frank CARLUCCI and Robert Booth Nichols. So here's the newspaper article. Cairns was on the front pages. These guys are selling all the evidence to destroy Dr. Jim Cairns, and then that triggered the dismissal of Gough Whitlam. Here is a major article confirming, and with an interview, which I'm going to play in a minute, with Harry Gillam. He was known as Double Deuce agent for MI6 during the Churchill era, and Michael met him through his links with Sir Dennis Kendall, MI6, and Sir Norman Davies, MI6. So it turns out that Michael had met him, and also Eric C. Cowles. And Eric C. Cowles was a business associate of, and Harry Gillam, of Robert Booth Nichols, with 5 Half Moon Street is the address where the scandal is breaking in the apartment owned by Harry Gillam. So now let's look at the interview of Harry Gillam in his apartment at 5 Half Moon Street, Mayfair.
I was approached by a group of very rich Arabs and asked if I knew anyone in the Australian government, because they would like to fund some money to the Australian government, and they were aware that Dr. Cairns was going to a conference in Paris within a few days, and was it possible for me to arrange a meeting if the Australian government were interested in borrowing money. I contacted Mr. Eric Searchouse and asked him if he knew anyone that he could approach as to whether the government would be interested in borrowing. He came back to me next day and said yes, they would be interested in setting up such a meeting with a funding source, and this could be done whilst the minister was in Paris. Subsequently, Mr. Philip Cairns telephoned me and made certain arrangements as to the time and place of this meeting. First of all, with my liaison officer, who is a high-ranking RAF officer, and then a place and meeting to be decided later to meet the gentleman with the money. This was the only thing that was the only discussion that took place with Mr. Philip Cairns, and a meeting was arranged between the liaison officer and Dr. Cairns, and a meeting was set up to meet the funding gentleman on the following Saturday. But Dr. Cairns was unable to attend this meeting. He left very early in the morning, and that was the end of the affair.
This was all normal commercial movements, the sort of thing that you're perfectly used to handling.
Oh yes, I mean this is a normal thing. I mean it's normal for governments to borrow money, and it's normal for them to go through these channels.
What's not normal, perhaps, is that the son of a finance minister, in this case Mr. Philip Cairns, allegedly anyway, was to receive commission on the loan should the deal go through. How did that arise?
Well, it was mentioned to me in the telex sent to me by Mr. Eric Searcowes, and the impact of it wasn't so great on me at the time, because a lot of these loans never really get off the ground. And had it been a fait accompli, and I'd received a telex that I had to pay so much money to the son of a minister or somebody in public service, I would then have queried it with the person who sent me the telex, in this case Mr. Eric Searcowes.
Was a figure involved?
A figure was involved, a percentage figure, that the commission coming to our side was to be split three ways: one part to myself, one part to Mr. Philip Cairns, and one part to Mr. Eric Searcowes.
The most important part is that Harry Gillam is being interviewed by the media, exposing the scandal that brought down Dr. Jim Cairns and the Australian Prime Minister Gough Whitlam. I have all of the handwritten notes of Danny Casolaro confirming the names of Harry Gillam, Eric Searcowes, the dismissal of Gough Whitlam. He was about to expose one of the biggest scandals, that it was a CIA MI6 sting to bring down the Australian government. And if you may remember the Falcon and the Snowman, with Christopher Boyce's testimony that he was horrified about what NSA and CIA at Pine Gap were doing against the Australian government, that they were spying on all their communications and were involved in political interference of the Australian government. I'll do another podcast on that, which the evidence is it's Pine Gap and the Echelon satellite network. But Danny Casolaro was going to rewrite history by publishing the evidence that Frank CARLUCCI, Robert Booth Nichols, together with Harry Gillam's MI6, Eric Searcowes' MI6 and CIA assassin, had set up Dr. Jim Cairns and Australian Prime Minister Gough Whitlam in the biggest scandal in 1975, leading to their dismissal. I've highlighted there 5 Half Moon Street because this is very important. Danny had evidence of FBI records on Robert Booth Nichols, their wiretapping, and records of Robert Booth Nichols throughout the 80s and early 90s in stings linking him to the Gambino Mafia, in major fraud cases, and also allegations of involvement with drugs and arms through Australia, with his companies in Australia, listing all of his Australian residencies in Australia, properties in London, Italy, and also Switzerland, and also Honolulu and California. But the address there is quite clear for everyone to see. The interview by the journalist from Rupert Murdoch's company, media outlets in the UK and also the other Australian journalists are all being conducted in the room and apartment of Harry Gillam at 5 Half Moon Street, where he's selling all the documentary memos and evidence with Eric C. Cowles to bring down Dr. Jim Cairns and Gough Whitlam. They're selling the document after setting it up. I allege that Rupert Murdoch, who was on a campaign to get rid of Gough Whitlam with his links with MI6 and with CIA, was fully aware that this was a sting to bring down the Australian Gough Whitlam government. Let's go a little bit further and now have a look at the importance of 5 Half Moon Street. At 5 Half Moon Street, there's the photographs of the interview with Harry Gillam, MI6, working for Frank CARLUCCI and Robert Booth Nichols. They're business associates of Robert Booth Nichols. On the right there is Eric C. Cowles admitting that the whole thing was fraudulent and that he works for CIA and involved in other covert operations. The media believes now that it is a sting, but no one could prove it. This is the evidence that Danny Casolaro would have rewritten the history of the Loans Affair interference in Australia. I'm going to now show you the importance of the address. This is the apartment 5 Half Moon Street, Mayfair, London, where the interviews were conducted with Harry Gillam. It's actually the address of Robert Booth Nichols' apartment. Michael Riconosciuto in June 2004, before he turned up and threatened me, had written by letter advising me that after the loan scandal, there was a serious dispute about money between Robert Booth Nichols and Harry Gillam, and that Robert Booth Nichols killed him by hitting him in the back of the head with an ice pick in his apartment at 5 Half Moon Street, Mayfair, and stole all his assets, his bank accounts, and also his apartment. Harry Gillam had hidden in his tie all the secret account numbers of the money of their dealings for sting operations and links with the Loans Affair and Nugan Bank in Australia and other covert operations involving Eric C. Cowles and Harry Gillam, Robert Booth Nichols, Frank CARLUCCI, Ted Shackley and William Colby. Here is the official license for Robert Booth Nichols to carry a concealed machine gun. It lists all of his addresses in Australia. You'll find that at 8 Sandford Street, St. Lucia in Queensland, Australia, he owned the property. He owns a castle in northern Italy. He owns properties in France. But he owned 5 Half Moon Street, Mayfair, London, England. This is the smoking gun. Danny had all the FBI investigation reports, including this. I don't know if he knew about the address 5 Half Moon Street. I couldn't find any evidence on that, but this is what I've uncovered. Who is licensed to carry a concealed machine gun? And it confirms all of the activities and addresses, but it is Australia, Queensland. It is 5 Half Moon Street, Mayfair, London. This substantiates independently that Robert Booth Nichols was intimately involved with Harry Gillam and Eric Sears, just as he advised Danny Casolaro and had advised me 3 months before Robert Booth Nichols came to Australia to threaten my life. That's why Robert Booth Nichols was all over Danny. He was exposing PROMIS. He was exposing Nugan Bank, BCCI, and the CIA operation of the Octopus to bring down the Australian government. Danny Casolaro was going to rewrite the history. This is the legal evidence that substantiates the relationship between Robert Booth Nichols, Frank CARLUCCI. I will do another podcast of the major fraud case in 2004 to 2009 with the FBI London investigators on the major fraud case involving a US $250 billion US security note in a safe at the banks at London, that Robert Booth Nichols was using the PROMIS software with Samuel Israel in his major fraud case, and he confesses to the investigators and attorneys that he had been working for Frank CARLUCCI on suppressing anti-American activities in Australia throughout the 70s and 80s. Independent of everything, he, out of his own mouth, is going to substantiate the evidence that Michael provided Danny Casolaro in 91 and provided to me in June 2004, before Robert Booth Nichols appears to threaten my life. And so Harry Gillam filmed at his apartment, and Robert Booth Nichols has that apartment 5 Half Moon Street on his license to carry a concealed machine gun at the same address. This is happening in 1984. But more importantly, this is the address, 5 Half Moon Street, that Robert Booth Nichols was located on the day that Danny was murdered, to substantiate that he was not involved in the murder of Danny Casolaro. So this address has significance. It's the address of bringing down the Australian government in a CIA MI6 sting, headed by Ted Shackley, William Colby, Frank CARLUCCI, Henry Kissinger, and Robert Booth Nichols, with Harry Gillam and Eric Sear Cowles. And it's the same address where he is at when, on the day that Danny dies, in order to make sure he's not in the country. And Michael has given me recorded interviews that he confirms that he's been to this apartment, and not only that, was in the taxi with Robert Booth Nichols and Eric Sear Cowles when Eric Sear Cowles was planning to assassinate President Reagan, and was thrown out of the car, out of the taxi in London. So the Nugan Bank links and Banca Ambrosiana and BCCI is now proven to the links of what Danny Casolaro was going to expose. The Octopus, arms, drugs, money laundering, and CIA PROMIS software, Swift banking. The decision to get rid of Dr. Jim Cairns, Federal Treasurer of Australia, and Gough Whitlam, is that they were exposing the activities that CIA was spying on the Australian government with the Echelon network at Pine Gap in Australia, which was substantiated years later independently by Christopher Boyce in the film The Falcon and the Snowman, and he was disgusted on what NSA and CIA were doing to the Australian government, causing him to then be arrested for divulging top secret information.